It was a machine that defied the laws of physics, or at least the laws of military logic as they were understood in 1928. Imagine a world where the standard speed for a tank was roughly 4 miles per hour, a slow, grinding metal coffin that could barely keep pace with a walking infantryman. Now, imagine a vehicle tearing across a muddy field at 42 miles per hour, launching itself off earthen ramps, flying through the air, and landing with the grace of a jungle cat before speeding off again. This wasn't science fiction, it was real. It was American, and the United States Army hated it. They didn't just dislike it. They actively destroyed the career of the man who built it. They buried the technology in paperwork, ridiculed the concept, and refused to adopt a weapon that was 15 years ahead of its time. This is the story of the Christie M1928, a weapon that could have ended the Second World War in 1943 had it been in the hands of the nation that invented it. Instead, the rejection of this single machine forced the United States to play a deadly game of catch-up, while their discarded blueprints became the backbone of the Soviet Union's victory on the Eastern Front. To understand the magnitude of this mistake, we have to go back to the mindset of the interwar period. The generals in charge of the U.S. Ordnance Department in the late 1920s were men whose tactical imagination was still trapped in the mud of the Somme. To them, a tank had one purpose: to act as a moving shield for infantry. It didn't need to be fast. It needed to be heavy, slow, and reliable. Speed was considered a liability. If a tank moved too fast, the infantry couldn't keep up, and the coordination of the line would break. They viewed warfare as a slow, methodical collision of masses. Enter J. Walter Christie. He was not a soldier. He was a race car designer. He was an arrogant, brilliant, difficult genius who had designed front-wheel drive systems for fire engines and racing cars that broke world speed records. When he turned his attention to tanks, he didn't see a moving shield. He saw a predator. Christie believed that speed was the ultimate armor. If you are moving at 60 miles per hour, you are almost impossible to hit with the artillery of the day. Christie unveiled his masterpiece, the M1928, at Fort Meade, Maryland. The observers were stunned. The tank didn't clank and rattle like the tractors they were used to. It hummed. It featured a revolutionary suspension system, large road wheels on long coil springs that allowed each wheel to move independently. This meant the tank could absorb the shock of rough terrain without shaking the crew to death. It could drive on tracks for cross-country combat, or the crew could remove the tracks in 30 minutes and drive it on rubber wheels down a highway at highway speeds. During the demonstration, the Christie tank obliterated the competition. It traversed trenches that trapped standard Army vehicles. It climbed slopes that were deemed impassable. It achieved speeds that made the official Army stopwatch holders think their equipment was broken. It was the first modern main battle tank in history. And the Ordnance Department said, no, the rejection wasn't based on performance. The performance was undeniable. The rejection was personal and bureaucratic. Christie was abrasive. He called the generals incompetent to their faces. He refused to follow their strict, outdated specifications. They labeled the vehicle mechanically unreliable as an excuse to kill the project, despite it running circles around their own designs. They strangled Christie's company with red tape, delayed payments, and eventually, the U.S. Army turned its back on the concept entirely, opting instead for the clunky, top-heavy designs that would eventually evolve into the M3 Lee and the M4 Stuart tanks that were adequate, but hardly revolutionary. But ideas do not die just because a bureaucracy rejects them. While the Americans scoffed, others were watching. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union was desperate to modernize its military. They saw the footage of Christie's flying tank. They didn't see a liability. They saw the future of deep battle doctrine. Soviet agents approached Christie. The U.S. government had blocked the sale of weapons to the USSR, but Christie was broke, angry, and vindictive against the army that had spurned him. He agreed to sell. To bypass the export restrictions, the tanks were shipped out of the United States without their turrets. On the shipping manifest, they were labeled as agricultural tractors. When these tractors arrived in the Soviet Union, Russian engineers were astounded. They took Christie's suspension system, the very system the US Army called flimsy, and they perfected it. They built the BT series of fast tanks, which were essentially direct copies of Christie's design. They learned that speed, combined with sloped armor and a heavy gun, created a devastating combination. Fast forward to 1941, Operation Barbarossa. The German Wehrmacht invades Russia. The Germans are confident. Their panzers have conquered all of Europe. They believe the Russians are backward, equipped with obsolete trash. Then, they encounter the T-34. The T-34 was the direct descendant of the rejected Christie M1928. It used the Christie suspension. It used the sloped armor concepts. It was fast, maneuverable, and nearly impervious to German anti-tank guns. German General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, wrote in panic that the T-34 was vastly superior to anything Germany possessed. The shells from German tanks simply bounced off the T-34's sloped armor, while the Soviet tanks used their Christie-derived speed to flank and destroy the invaders. It is no exaggeration to say that the T-34 saved Moscow. It halted the German advance. It was the weapon that broke the back of the Wehrmacht at Kursk. And inside the DNA of that Soviet savior was the ghost of J. Walter Christie's rejected American dream. Meanwhile, the United States entered the war in 1941 with a tank doctrine that was already obsolete. American crews in North Africa and Europe were sent into battle in the M4 Sherman. The Sherman was reliable and easy to produce, but it was tall, had a high center of gravity, and used a suspension system that was inferior to the one Christie had offered them 15 years prior. American tankers called their own vehicles Ronsons because they lit up the first time they were hit. The irony is suffocating. The US Army eventually did use a variation of the Christie suspension in the M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, proving that the technology was viable all along. But it was too little, too late for the thousands of crews who died in inferior machines. If the US Ordnance Department had swallowed their pride in 1928, if they had looked past Christie's abrasive personality and seen the genius of the machine, the United States would have entered World War II with a main battle tank superior to anything in the German arsenal. They would have had the mobility to conduct their own blitzkrieg years before the term was even coined. The war in Europe could have looked drastically different. The hedgerows of Normandy, which bogged down the sluggish Shermans, would have been traversed with ease. Instead, the flying tank became a footnote in American procurement history, a what-if buried in a dusty file cabinet. The weapon that was years ahead of its time was not defeated by enemy fire, or by a flaw in its design. It was defeated by a room full of men sitting around a mahogany table, who decided that 40 miles per hour was simply too fast for war. History is often written by the victors, but in the case of military technology, it is often written by the survivors of bureaucratic incompetence. J. Walter Christie died nearly penniless in 1944, just as the tanks based on his designs were rolling into Berlin, driven by the Soviet Army, proving once and for all that he had been right. The refusal of his weapon remains one of the greatest self-inflicted wounds in military history, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one across the battlefield, but the one signing the checks at headquarters.